Hi, my name is Eric Bright. I'm an 8th grade math teacher at Charleston Middle School. I've worked with the ISBE Committee for Math Curriculum Models, and I'm a state trainer for Common Core. And I've also been doing some local professional development workshops for people, and I wanted to get out some videos that might let people go through some of these processes on their own. So today we're going to talk about accurate assessment and how we can really get to the idea of student content mastery and make our grades actually a little bit meaningful, because I do think we've got quite a problem on our hands right now with the way that we grade. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, you can contact me through my email address right up here. So let's move ahead. Let me start by asking this question. Have you ever gotten a grade you didn't deserve? And why did you not deserve it? Now, when I ask this at workshops, I get stories about, yeah, I really didn't understand what I was doing in a calculus class, but I knew that the teacher always made the answers either 1 or 0. So I just always guessed either 1 or 0, and I ended up getting over half of them right, and then based on the curve in the class, I ended up with a B. Without getting anything higher than like a 30 or 40% on a test. Okay, that's a real story there. For me, I got a grade I didn't think I deserved one time. I was in college and we were doing a group assignment, and I ended up doing a lot of the work on the group assignment, and the TA, because it wasn't actually a professor, it was a TA who was running that section, and it was an education course, asked us to evaluate our group work. And what sort of he said, if you were going to grade yourself, what grade would you give yourself? And so me, in a fit of false humility, I guess, said, oh well, I should only get an A minus. And of course all my group members, who did way less work than me, said that they should have gotten an A, and they did. They got the A and I got the A minus. So there are lots of problems with our grading system, and these are just kind of two anecdotal stories. Um, so let me ask you this question then. Here are some grades for a student listed there. What should the final grade be for this student? And you go ahead and pause the video if you would, and think about that and see if you can answer it. And now that you're back, let's talk while you're, or think. What did you come up with? What final grade should the student get? And I hope you'll agree that you're going to get answers that range anywhere. You could say, well, the student should have an A in class because their last grade was an A. They had 2 A's out of those last 3, and really that's probably where they should end up at the end. You have other people who could be on the other end of the spectrum and say, well, look at those, the majority of those grades are F's, so that student probably should have a failing grade. And it's all over the spectrum. And so, probably, as you might guess, the right answer is that we need some more information before we can even start to determine that. So let me give you this information then. What if the student got all of those F's just on the homework? So, they got a couple D's there on homework, but all the rest are F's. C on the first quiz, a B on the first test, C on the next quiz, a B on the next test, an A on the final project, and an A on the final exam. What grade does this student deserve? Now, even now, with more information in hand, it's hard for us to agree on what grade this student deserves. And it would be even harder, I think, if we flip this around. What if all the D's and F's were on the quizzes and tests, and all the A's and B's were on the homework? There's a probably even stronger feelings on that side of the fence than on the side that I've got presented to you right now. So the bottom line is we don't even agree as professionals what grades should mean. What is the purpose of what it is that we're doing in our classrooms with assessment? What does a grade represent? Well, what I'm saying is the bottom line, what I think we can agree on, if we all came together, we could say, does the student get it? Do they get it? Do they understand the mathematics? That's what we're trying to get at with assessment. That's what classroom assessment is all about for us. And if that's the case, if we're trying to get at the fact of whether or not they actually understand what's going on, then that purpose, that underlying purpose, is going to drive several other decisions as we go through this exploration of assessments. Let me put a better terminology maybe into this. Really, the purpose of assessment is to determine to what degree a student has mastered content standards with a high degree of validity and reliability. Now, validity and reliability, probably two terms you haven't heard since your college course on assessment. You probably only had one if you had any at all. And validity, it really means, is it valid? Is it measuring what we're supposed to be measuring? We're going to see a little bit later on that we think that we're giving a math grade and we're not. Sometimes we're giving an art grade. Sometimes we're giving a effort grade that has really nothing to do with math. It's really not getting at whether or not the student gets it. And then reliability is, can we produce consistent results? Now, this is not only across evaluators, so if one student was in one class and was graded by a teacher and then transferred and took that same test with another teacher, would they get basically the same grade? I mean, obviously we're going to have some wiggle room in there between teachers, but are they going to have consistent results across evaluators? Not only that, but are they going to have consistent results over time? And so this is retention of information and actual true understanding rather than short-term memory. So in other words, if we just have one test with one question on it, that's not enough to actually produce reliable data. We're going to need more data points as we go along. In fact, research tells us that we need around 10 questions per skill that we're going to be assessing to really know with a high degree of reliability how well that student has mastered that particular content standard. Okay, so now this boils down to, if our purpose is to get at whether or not a student gets it, okay, so we're trying to drive into the fact of, does the student have content mastery? There are two types of assessment that are going to be used in our classroom. The first one is formative assessment, and this is assessment for learning. So the whole point of this is that we want to figure out some information about a student and about their content mastery, which is going to inform us as teachers so that we can change our instruction, so that we can change possibly our instruction strategies, and it might also inform students and or parents about how they can guide their learning when they're outside of the classroom. So parents might be able to help point their students in a direction to study. Students might be able to do some self-assessment to figure out some weak points before they get to a big grade that's going to count a lot towards their final grade, so that way they've got some early warning systems in place. This is going to be, well, it might be formal, and you can check out how to build some assessments, formative assessments on my other videos for ways that you can make that formal. But oftentimes it's informal, the way that we do it right now. Sometimes we'll just use our observations. We'll just look around and say, you know what, I really don't think these kids get it. Sometimes it might be effort, that we can kind of just look around the class and go, boy, nobody's actually trying here. And until people start trying, I'm not going to get a good idea whether or not these people know it. Exit slips. We use exit slips sometimes, and that's a great formative assessment that's not super formal. Just, on your way out, jot down a couple pieces of information. Then we as the teacher can use that to change or modify instruction for the following day based on how we feel students are understanding when they leave our classroom. Now, this information may be more qualitative than quantitative in nature. Not always, but often, because we're trying to remember, this is assessment for learning. So if we're going to help learning, if we're going to help improve learning with this, which is really the purpose of formative assessment, then it's probably going to have some more qualitative pieces to it. And it's also going to include meaningful feedback to students if we want students to be able to act on these formative assessments. Students need to be able to take a look at the feedback that we give them and then make modifications in their own learning, make changes or go back and study a particular section or a particular skill so that they can improve their own understanding heading into some more important, or not maybe more important, but summative grades, which we're going to get to in a little bit. So what does the formative process look like? The formative process starts off with, where is the student at in their content mastery? We want to know, where do they need to be then? And then we try and say, how do we get there? Okay, so it's really a three-step process. Where are you at? Where do you need to be? And how do we get there? and then we're going to act on that information. If we don't actually act on that information, it's not worth gathering. There's no reason to include formative assessments in your classroom if it's just going to sit there and do nothing and gather dust. It's kind of like those binders that you put together for all your curriculum stuff that just sit on your shelf. Yeah, don't need those either. So the formative assessment actually needs to be useful. Now here's the kind of the kicker for me with formative assessment and throughout this whole process. If we're gauging where the student is at in their content mastery, and we know where they need to go to be at a mastery level for content, then generally speaking, we're expecting them to not have mastered the content yet. So what we're saying is, okay, I know you don't get it, but I need to know where you're at in the process. And so the kicker then is, if I know you don't get it yet, and I do not expect you to get it yet, then formative assessments are not going to be included in a student's final grade, because that is a summative assessment, which we're going to get to in just a moment. So for this formative assessment, it's not part of a grade. It's a tool that we use for learning. It's not an assessment of learning, which is the summative. So some examples of formative assessments: you might have some pre-tests, mastery tasks, which are what I call them, but most people call it like bell work or warm-ups, homework accuracy, homework completion, participation grades, your exit slips. You might give a weekly survey on how students are doing with their self-regulation skills. You might have some whiteboard work that students do in class that they just, as they're working on the whiteboard, you can take a quick look around class and see how the skills are improving. You might have some classroom activities, some learning tasks, and be gathering some observational data. Practice quizzes that you could take in class, projects where students are working together, or project-based learning, group work. These are all examples of some formative assessments. And again, it comes down to our purpose. Is the purpose of this formative assessment, or this assessment that we've designed, is it to figure out where a student is at and how we can get them to mastery? And if it is, then it's formative and not summative. So a formative assessment is going to tie directly into our standards most of the time. Sometimes we might be looking at participation or effort just as some work ethic type skills, but the vast majority of the time it's going to tie directly into the standards, and it's going to focus on the student learning needs. What do they need to progress in their understanding? It's going to identify where they're at right now, so where are they at in their progress, and then give results that we can act on. Okay. So, and again, if you can't act on it, don't gather the data. This should be a regular part of your instruction. It shouldn't interrupt your instruction. It should just be part of it. Okay, it's not a, oh, everybody stop, we got to take this assessment now. It's just part of what you do in the classroom to gauge where students are at and help them improve their understanding. It should be quick, it should be easy, and above all, it's got to be not time consuming, okay? Because if it's going to provide feedback to students, you're going to have to, it's not only going to have to be quick and easy to give, it's going to also have to be quick and easy to grade. So most of my formative assessments that I gather in my classroom, I'm either gathering that data immediately, like as soon as they do it, or if they have to turn something in that ends up being a formative assessment, if I can't get it back to them the next day, as soon as they walk in, it is not worthwhile, because they need some feedback, to help improve their learning, so they know which direction they need to head before we hit some major assignment that's going to end up being more of a summative grade. Okay. So bottom line, please, if you don't use the data, stop gathering it. That's just hoop jumping and the latest educational fad at that point. So don't do that unless it's actually going to be used. Alright, so now let's put this next to summative assessments. Summative assessments are assessments of learning. It's an assessment that summarizes a student's mastery of a standard. So this is where we really, the rubber hits the road here for, does a student get it? Do they understand the content? Okay, this has to do directly with the standards. This is usually formal in nature. We've got tests, quizzes, it might be multiple choice or short response tests, there might be word problems, projects, performance-based assessments, you might have portfolios, whatever it is. It's usually somehow formal in nature and usually quantitative, at least in our current educational climate it is. Now, the purpose of this is to give a picture of how well a student has mastered a standard at a specific time. So that means we're saying by now I would expect you to have mastered this content. We are moving on to other content. We're moving on to other standards that we're going to explore. And at this point I would expect you to have it mastered. And now I need to gauge at what level you have mastered this content, and then I will summarize that into some quantitative value. Okay? That's a summative assessment. By definition, this is a student's grade. Anything that goes into a student's grade is really meant to be a summative assessment. Not that the formative assessments are not important. Of course they are. They're valuable. But they don't represent what a student has mastered as far as content. So a summative checklist here of how we would kind of design one of these things. It's the summative assessments are going to tie directly into our content standards. They're going to include multiple levels of learning, whether it's Bloom's taxonomy, whether it's Webb's depth of knowledge, but it's also going to include the multiple levels within the Common Core standards, the conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and application. Those multiple levels help us differentiate between the A students and the B students, help us differentiate between the B and the C students, okay? Or if you're not on an ABC scale, differentiate between the exceeds and the meets students. Okay, it's got to summarize their overall learning progress, and so to do that, we have to be able to differentiate. We're at a point right now where grade inflation is rampant, and somehow we have every student who's above average. It's a miracle that happens, and it's just not true. It's not accurate. And the last thing about a summative assessment is it's got to give results that all stakeholders can understand. So the teachers need to be able to understand what it means. Students, parents, administrators, everybody needs to look at that and know what it means. This is one of the key things that we are absolutely lacking in our current educational environment. We look at a grade and have no idea. In fact, I've talked to several college admissions officers. Our local high school recently went through a GPA revision process, and we talked to several colleges, and colleges basically said that they don't care what high school grades are, because the only thing that high school grades tell them is that they did what the teacher asked them. They realize that grades have no bearing on whether or not students actually understand mathematics or are prepared for upper level mathematics. All it says is that you did what the teacher told you to do. In fact, the University of Illinois, if you look at their website, they've completely taken off GPA and grades off of the requirements for entering into college, because it's just not, we have no standardized process for what these grades should mean. And we pretend otherwise. I think we pretend like we know what these things stand for, but they currently have no meaning and no value in our culture. They're just completely up to the whims of the classroom. So what I'm proposing is we need to actually have a professional dialogue about this and come to a consensus about how we can fix this. And I think, let's go back to our original purpose, I think we would all agree that the grade should represent, does the student get it? Does the student understand the mathematics? Okay, and if that's true, then what we're looking for is content mastery. Not that the other things are not important. Formative assessments are important. Their progress is important. Their effort is important. Their work ethic is important. Their teamwork abilities are important. Their cooperation in group settings are the skills that they have with that are important. All of those things are hugely important for students to learn and master. But as far as our math grade, it should represent math. Okay. Now, if I had it my way, we'd also have grades for those other things too. We'd have a work ethic grade, and we would have, a progress grade. How much progress have you made? How much growth have you made? But they would have to be separate, because otherwise, what can happen is we can have students who put forth tons and tons of effort and don't understand a thing, and they end up with an A, and we can have students who put forth no effort at all but understand everything, and they end up with an F. And this does not represent how well students understand mathematics, and it doesn't get to the heart of what a student needs to capture through their educational environment and through their educational process in K through 12. All right, so Last thing for summative assessments here, make sure you've offered students examples of what meeting the standards looks like prior to actually giving them a summative assessment. So before you can say, I've summarized your learning in this way, they have to know what mastery looks like. And that's why formative assessment is so important, because we have to use that formative assessment to build students up to prepare them for these summative assessments. Okay. Now I mentioned earlier how we needed, 10, around 10. Research says at least 5, but preferably 10 summative assessment questions for each skill, okay, that we're trying to teach. So we're going to have to build these summative things kind of over time to establish that reliability. All right, next we're going to look at some specific assessment types.